Bob, thank you so much for doing this. You and I, we've known each other for since 2008. It's a long time. We are both getting old. Um, when I got accepted to Stanford, the first thing I did, I bought the no asshole rule and read that, and I thought it would be a perfect preparation for the PhD, and I found it very helpful. But I'm not sure if it's the best preparation. I'll say a few words about Bob Sutton for those of you who don't know him. Um, Bob Sutton has pulled off something which very, very few people pulled off. He's a star among academics and a star among practitioners. And these are typically two audiences which are completely incompatible. So this is truly special. You can see this, by the way, in the audience. We have lots of faculty who's actually decided to join. But we also have lots of practitioners, lots of INSEAD alumni, but also people outside of INSEAD who decided to join. To give a little bit of context more, Bob is the person I cite the most often when I teach classes. So every of my students has heard the saying, speak as if you're right, listen as if you're wrong, or if two people have the same opinion, one of them is redundant. These are all things that go back to Bob. So this is a familiar face to everybody who's ever taken a PhD class of me, or an MBA class. Bob has a beautiful definition of leadership where he says, look, it's somebody you interact with and you feel more energized afterwards. And Bob is, in my opinion, in that sense, the perfect leader, because it's very difficult to interact with Bob and not feel more energized afterwards. So much about Bob. The kind of evident thing you have seen from the profile, he's a professor of engineering in the management science and engineering unit at Stanford University. A few things about the book before we get going. The book is absolutely fascinating. It's a very atypical book, in my opinion. What Huggy Rao, his co-author, and Bob Sutton have done is they've worked for the last 10 years, basically, or 7 years. But in my opinion, you started thinking about these questions a little bit before that. So you have worked on these issues for 10 years, and now you're basically writing up your experiences. So this is not a new fancy idea where you start a movement. This is more like a movement you started 10 years ago, and now you kind of build up on all the experience you have, on all the anecdotes. And so it's an incredibly rich book, okay? Very often you would have much, much less for a book, but it's a really kind of rich book. The book is also unique. I just give you one example for how unique it is, okay? It uses the DMV as a positive example for organization. I think that's a really first. Normally the DMV is always the go-to example for things that do not work.
So Henning, just on that, we actually are doing a deeper case study, and I recently advised my friends at Google that they have a lot of lessons to learn from the California Department of Motor Vehicles about improving human experience, and I believe it.
One thing I like most about the book, and I want to very much honor this is the concept: you're a trustee of other people's time. And I want to take that very serious. We have 330 people on the call, and I want to be a trustee of their people's time. So we are managing 1 hour of lifetime of 330 people. So let's kind of let's make the most use of it. Bob, you did something I'm envious of, because you have encountered the same problem that all of us encountered, but you made a fantastic book out of it. So I feel you were mostly annoyed and then said, let me write a book about this. So what's the problem? What inspired you to do this?
Well, well, you're right. So you sort of called me out, which is that there are some official reasons we wrote this book. I'll get to the official reasons in a moment. But what really got us going was there were so many organizations that we worked with, because our last book was on scaling, and these people wanted to grow these big organizations. They wanted to scale, baby, scale. And then their dreams came true, and it was kind of hell. Ask anybody who works at Google right now. It ain't fun. And Facebook, now Meta, a lot less fun to work there when it was little, and they wanted to scale, baby, scale. And so Huggy and I would say the way that I frame our work is we're interested in elements of leading at scale. So how you grow an organization, how you deal stuff, how you spread stuff in a big organization. And then this book is sort of what do you do with your organization as it's sort of gotten kind of mucky. And so that's that's the rational part. But yes, you called me on it. I think the reason that we wrote the book was, well, your former university and my employer, Stanford University, it just got harder and harder and harder to get things done during the 40 years I've been there. So
Well,
so it's both personal and intellectual.
the book is full of it, but give our listeners like a short impression of like what are like the kind of friction that kind of make life for people so hard in organizations, or to get work done so hard in organizations.
Well, just 2 or 3 examples. One is just when you're bombarded with so many emails and so many Slack messages that you have to spend your whole days reading and answering them, or you're not actually doing your job. That's familiar to all of us. Another one, which we talk about some in the book and we're continuing to study, is this idea when your tech stack gets larger and larger in an organization, everybody puts in their pet software, and there's all this switching costs and all this learning costs. So that would be another example of bad friction. And some of the ones that drive us all most crazy, in the U.S. healthcare system, I don't know Europe so well, but I know a little bit about the NHS though. In the U.S. healthcare system, it's essentially a story of friction and fragmentation. That you as a patient or a family member, there's all these different departments and resources and people available, but nobody gives you the guide. You've got to guide yourself through the system. So one of the papers we talk about by our own Melissa Valentine from our department, Management, Science, and Engineering, is about the cancer tax. She showed that when a member of a family got cancer at a large cancer center, essentially it was a full-time job for somebody to help them navigate through the system. So those are bad friction. We can talk about good friction, but there's also the emotional part. There's stuff that drive you crazy, essentially. That might be another way to do it. That it shouldn't be this hard, but it is.
You point this out to some program, and I found it really depressing, where you said like, look, the person started working like late at night just to get any work done. So it was basically like the whole day you were dealing with like emails and stuff like that, and then you ended up working like in the middle of the night to do your actual job. So yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot of engineers can relate to that, and a lot of PhD students too. Since you were a PhD student, and a lot of professors, a lot of times we end up dealing with the bureaucracy in our own institutions, and then we end up having to hide at night to finish our work. A lot of engineers.
But I was thinking about the book in a little bit of a broader context. There's so much work on like personal productivity, right? Like what should I eat? What time should I go to sleep? And blah, 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 blah. But it feels like this is always falling short, because the moment I kind of come to the office at 9 a.m. or whenever, it's like, okay, here's like a barrage of emails, urgent things I now need to deal with. So say a little bit about this kind of our focus on personal productivity and organizational fiction on the other hand.
Well, I like that question, because our perspective, I'm an organizational psychologist, is it isn't just about what you can do on your job and your productivity. It's realizing your interdependence with other people. And I think that's a theme that probably runs through all my research. My mentor, Robert Kahn, taught me that in the 80s, that when you are part of an organization, the interdependencies are what matter. So that's why we always talk about the notion of one's cone of friction. So whether you're a CEO or the aforementioned DMV employee, being aware of how you are wittingly or unwittingly making things harder or easy for other people. And then a lot of times to fix systems, it has to be a collective activity where the actors help one another improve the system, including making some things harder. But to me, everything from fixing addition sickness to broken connection. So we talk about language, jargon, monoxide. These are all sort of collective sources of friction, good or bad friction, that people need to work on together. It's hard to fix them alone.
So one thing I find so fascinating, and I remember when this happened, there's this anecdote about the 7-Up CEO, I believe, who didn't like a piece of music or something like that, and you got rather obsessed with that example. So it very often happens, right, that people create friction without actually knowing it or without intending to do so. Can you say a word about that?
Well, so one of the things, and everybody out here, this is like sort of a sophisticated management audience, we all hear about the notion of resistance to change. And if, you know, it's a classic thing. If you talk to some senior executives, you can get them moaning and bitching about resistance to change. But one of the hallmarks of power, which, and anybody's ever been in a power relationship knows this, is that when you're in a position of power, people watch you more closely. Your underlings, and you watch them. We're actually just joking about a friend of ours who was Jerry Davis, I'll use his name, who was editor of the most prestigious journal in our field. And Jerry was joking when he was editor, people watched him really closely and they kissed up to him constantly. It's just the nature of power. What happens, though, is that sometimes, and this comes from the late, great James March, organizational theorist, when you're a leader, weak signals get over amplified. So I think the example you might have been referring to is early in my career, we saw a multi-million-dollar courtesy effort started at a bunch of convenience stores in the United States, 7-Eleven they're called, because the CEO came back from a visit to a 7-Eleven store. There was a rude clerk. He had a short temper tantrum and he just thought that was it. A couple of years later, they were spending millions of dollars trying to get clerks to smile at you and to establish eye contact. And in this research, which I was involved in, what it showed was people don't go to 7-Eleven stores for courtesy. They just want to get in and out without anything bad happening. And that's what all of our evidence said. And he said, I bet your research showed that. And he was right. So but this classic notion when you're in a leadership position that yes, there's resistance to change, but because people watch you so closely and want to please you so much, and this is just the nature of hierarchy. It happens in baboon troops too. You've got to be careful to not have your symbols or signals get over amplified. And then that causes friction throughout the system because all these people do this thing they think you want, but you actually don't want it.
Bob, how should I say, it's super difficult to quantify, but do you have a feeling for like how harmful this friction is? You have a bunch of examples in how many hours have been saved at AstraZeneca and so on. Can you say a little bit about like examples of friction and how much burden they put on people or the organization?
Well, to me, some of the best stuff, the best evidence that I've seen about friction, and one that we almost all can relate, is just a lot of times this stuff is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you look at the research, and some of this has been done in both the United States and also in the UK, if you look at the effect of electronic health records, so that's when you go to the doctor, and they end up spending more times looking at the screen rather than looking at you, and because they've got to get the records right. There's evidence that with residents, or what do they call them, junior doctors in the United States or in the UK, I think. That they will spend 50 or 60% of their time messing with the electronic health records. And to me, that's just a burden that takes away from their ability to learn, their ability to provide healthcare, their ability to teach. So that's one of the sort of classic ways that in which it's quantified. And then you have things like Bain, the consulting firm. This is a cute example. There was a weekly executive meeting in one of their executive team meeting in one of their clients. And there's all of this preparation that's required for those meetings. You got to pre-meetings, you got to prepare stuff, blah, blah, blah. And they calculated that it was taking 300,000 hours a year to sort of run this lousy meeting of people's times. And to me, that some of that friction is necessary, and we should talk about positive friction too. But there actually are a lot of ways to calculate it. And just, you mentioned the Department of Motor Vehicles. A really good example of that is eventually every resident of the state of California is going to have to get something called a real ID. It's a more, I guess, safe license or whatever. And every resident has to go into the DMV and get a wet signature. So they have changed how long the average Californian takes when they're in the Department of Motor Vehicles from 28 to 8 minutes. So if you multiply that, that's a lot of time. So there are ways to quantify this.
But one, you have this, by the way, is not, you're not making a lot of friends with this book, right? You're kind of, you're criticizing, you're criticizing like every company I can kind of think of. And I mean, you applaud them for kind of getting, but you see, I actually really appreciate this. Just instead of like having one case study of like why that company is so amazing or that company is so amazing, you actually see how companies we might think of as great actually kind of run into various problems. And we already, I don't know if you've seen, we already have like one participant, Roger, who kind of points out like, hey, I just left Google, and kind of very much underscores what you described of the place at this point in time. You have this example of General Motors in there, and I find this very, very telling in why it is that friction can persist. Can you dive a little bit into this? Like what friction in the sales process, why it persisted?
Eventually we will get to positive, to good things, because
but don't blame me. You leave the positive friction until the very end.
but the book does have a lot of good news. But one of the things that General Motors, internationally struggling organization, which is actually, it's kind of amazing it's still alive given all it's gone through bankruptcies, it's gone through all these incredible problems, and Mary Barra is doing a great job of just keeping it alive, honestly. She's the CEO. But one of our arguments is that one reason that customer and employee experiences will be friction filled is that people at the top, they have the privilege, and one definition of privilege is the absence of inconvenience. And so if you, as the person who's responsible for the system, is protected from that inconvenience, you won't notice how little people suffer. So there is a program, and the last time I fact checked this was 3 years ago. 20 years ago, when I was working with General Motors, I saw this all over the place, a program where every manager, down to a surprisingly low level, gets a free car. Where maybe it's nominal, maybe it's a couple $100 a month, but it's basically a free car that's an employee benefit. And they deliver them the car. They are able to get gas on site. They get repairs on site. You don't have to deal with any of the hassle of essentially car ownership. You are literally protected from it. And for me, I don't know about you, one of the main reasons that I tend to keep cars forever is I hate the process of buying and selling a car. Sometimes I want a new car even now, but just the thought of having to go to a car dealer, I just don't even want to deal with that mess. And so that's a situation where one reason that people who work for General Motors don't quite understand what it means to own a car, and they tend to focus on the car itself rather than the system around it, is that they are literally protected from the inconveniences of car ownership that the rest of the world are. Oh, and gee, by the way, since I was involved with General Motors intermittently over the years, it's sort of a sin to drive another car maker's car onto a General Motors lot. And to me, that's the opposite. In a really great organization, you would be encouraged to use your competitor's product constantly to understand it. By contrast, since you're associated with INSEAD in France and everything, every sort of great winemaker I've ever met, they want to taste everybody's wines so that they can understand what the competition is like.
I remember this when the Nokia CEO changed at some point, and he asked, who of you has an iPhone? And hardly any hands went up. And he said, like, this is a real problem, because that's the product we need to compete against. That's really what we need to understand, right? So
yes.
So it's like an isolation kind of from the broader world, so to speak. Yeah. Let's come to some of the good news, Bob, because you point this out in the book that this book kind of, you actually acknowledge this, so that you pointed out originally we just wanted to write everything that goes bad, but then you actually discovered like friction fixers is how you call them. Let me say one thing about the book, which I really liked a lot, and I hope a lot of people in organizations read it, is you develop a fantastic vocabulary. You see, I think it's something that a lot of people actually feel, but sometimes it's very difficult to put like a word on it. And it's not like simply efficiency. But you develop a whole kind of language around it, which I think is incredibly helpful. So what I personally liked most about the book, or which I find most insightful, was the helper pyramid. I thought this was just fantastic, and it gave me a lot of hope in the sense of, okay, because there's a tendency like, okay, I'm part of the system, it's horrible, right, I can't do anything about it, okay? But you come up, okay, there's good news, what can people on different levels can do about it? Can you kind of dive a little bit into this?
Well, just as a general philosophy, our perspective, and this is why I go back to my good experience in the DMV, because there was an individual employee there who really made things better for 60 people, that all of us, whether we're at the bottom of an organization or we're the CEO, we have a cone of friction. and we have the power to make things better or worse for other people. And I think that's a good place to start. And obviously in organizations that are more psychologically safe and empower employees, they can have more an impact. But that's kind of where we start. And then we also talk about the sort of, if you will, the help pyramid is there's different ways in which people can help each other. Kind of at the bottom, we call it reframing. It's basically therapy. It's saying people, you'll get through this. You look back on it, it won't be, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. That's what it is.
I love how many things are therapy in life. We just find different names for it, like executive coaching and stuff.
Oh yeah, well, executive coach. So in fact, early on in the book, and Huggy and I had some argument about this. We were teaching a class, and this executive just said, "My job is part therapy and part organizational design. That's what I do all day long." And I thought that might be better than our 5 steps. But then above, so kind of above reframing is navigating. So this is where you've got sort of a messed up system that's really difficult to navigate, but there's people who are good at sort of showing you the way, sort of trail guides. Henning and I, since we remember of the Department of Management, Science and Engineering, there's an amazing woman there named Lori Cottle, who's the
Laurie. I just want to say Lori Cottle. Yeah,
Lori. This woman. She's been there almost as long as I have. I've been there 40 years. Whether you're an undergraduate or a master or a PhD student, she doesn't change the rules, although she does write them every now and then, and she can guide you to the best and easiest and also ethical path through the system. She's amazing. I just remarkable. So the Lori Cottles of the world. So we can those of us who've been in the department.
This is completely irrelevant, but Lori is the first person I always go to when I'm at Stanford and thank her for surviving this. Yeah.
So you are not alone.
No.
So by the way, for like none of the faculty in our department actually understands how it works except for Lori Cottle. Any of us could die except for her. Then there's shielding. Shielding is kind of like, well, there's all this junk going on, but you sort of serve as a human shield and take the grief for someone. This is when you've got a really, really productive engineer, and there's somebody in another department who's mad at him or her, and you're a boss, and you go to the meeting and take the grief so they can keep working. To me, that would be the definition of a great boss.
So you have a fantastic example for shielding, if I recall this correctly, from the kind of company which became Pixar later on. You mind sharing this with the audience?
Oh gosh. So this is Ed Catmull. So essentially the history of Pixar, it was actually part of George Lucas's empire, and it was a little group called the Computer Division. And Ed Catmull was not Pixar was not an overnight success. Ed Catmull and a guy named Alvy Ray Smith, who actually invented the technology that made making animated movies possible of the kind that Pixar makes. So they were kind of losing money. And what also happened at Lucas Enterprises, George Lucas's empire, was that George Lucas had an expensive divorce. This is like what happens in organizations. So they needed to save money because George Lucas had to pay off an expensive sort of like alimony payments or divorce settlement. So they start doing layoffs to save money. And so what happened was that this number 2 guy, his name was Greg Norby, he kept going to Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Catmull, who ran the computer division, and kept saying to them, I want to see your layoff list. I want to see your layoff list. We need to do a 25% layoff. And they kept kind of blowing off this guy, Doug Norby. But eventually he said, I have to see it tomorrow. So they gave him a list with 2 names on it, Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Catmull. And they gave him the list. He had a temper tantrum, screamed at him. But in the subsequent period, while they tried to figure out, well, what do we do with these difficult 2 people? Well, Steve Jobs came in and bought what became Pixar. And I've talked to Ed Catmull, seriously. Best business book ever written. You have it right here for your folks in the audience. Creativity Incorporated, my nomination for the best business book ever written. And Ed said,
a great job in promoting your book, by the way.
Oh, it is. Well, oh, come on, it's like the best.
It's a fantastic book.
Yeah, but so anyhow, what Ed said is there are times in my life when I've done layoffs when they were necessary, but we knew that Jobs was sort of sniffing around, And so we wanted to hold the whole thing together so he would buy it, the entire organization. And so there was some logic to that. But years later, when I went to Pixar, employees would talk to me about the day that Ed and Albie saved our jobs by literally serving as a human shield. But just to be clear, because he's like the most thoughtful executive I've ever met. With all due respect to all of us, but it might be because he doesn't have an MBA. Maybe he always says that. But he's got a PhD in computer science. But Ed just sort of says, yeah, there's times when I would do layoffs, but this was not the time. This was not the right thing.
So Randy Commissar wrote at some point there a book an article in HBR where he says like management is a little bit like minimally invasive surgery. You basically want to kind of fix a small thing and then want to get out of the way. So what I like about this shield idea a lot is that you see your role as management not so much in guiding people around, but like, look, let me protect you. You know what you're doing. I'll get out of the way and let me just do my job here, so to speak.
Well, to put on our organizational heroes caps, it goes way back at least 60 years that the purpose of management is to buffer the central function of the organization so it can operate. So really management is shock absorbers. That's something that's been in the organizational literature forever. And everybody out in that audience knows, dear managers, once you get promoted to that job, even when you go from being an individual contributor, having 3 people reporting to you, all of a sudden there's all this annoying stuff comes up that you didn't know your boss was doing. And when you get to be CEO, you can have those jobs. Maybe they get paid too much, but oh man, everything is thrown at you. So part of being a leader is being a shock absorber.
So on the one hand, it's a shock absorber, but you see, you have this, you refer to like American universities and the number of admins which have been added. And I'm not obsessed with universities, but it's a very nice example, right? That the number of faculty members, the professors have rested more or less stable, but the administration has completely exploded. But that's not a shock absorber at all. That's really kind of creating friction. Say a little bit about this, Bob.
Well, so we have a chapter on addition sickness, and so one of the problems, and it isn't just universities, it's a problem. Google's just as bad as your average university in this way, by the way. So what happens in all sorts of organizations, universities, government, Google, you sort of pick your organization, is as the organization grows, there's a tendency for what they call the administrative component to get larger and larger and larger. And one of the reasons that happens, and universities are an example, but so is Google, is that that in organizations, very often when people are in management positions, the more people who report to them, the more they get paid. And I believe that simple bit of incentive causes people to build all sorts of fiefdoms and have all sorts of people report to them. And then when you get people in a management role, those people have to justify their existence. And it's this sort of dynamic of bureaucracy that does not have to go on forever, but you have to be very careful. And as Henning was saying, if you take it out to infinity, pretty soon Stanford will be all administrators and one faculty member and one student. If the curve keeps going. When I got here 40 years ago at Stanford, there was exactly one person, Ken Down, who was responsible for. He was the money person for the whole school. There's only about 20%, 25% more tenure track faculty at Stanford since I got here. But now everywhere there are finance people. You just sort of, and they create work for one another and they create work for us. So that's the bad news, Henning. There are good things that happen. In fact, a lot of the book is about the notion that it is possible to fight friction. And somebody asked, is there good friction? Yeah, we got a whole chapter on that. And we have
I feel I'm keeping you from the good friction, Bob. So why don't you give us some of the good news in terms of...
Oh, sure. So
how can we remove... So there are 2 parts of good news, right? The one good news is like how you remove bad friction, but then there's also the part in how you can create good friction.
So, well, let me just say briefly that the book is actually filled with ways to remove bad friction through subtraction, through simple rules that make it hard to add friction, bad friction. So we have a lot about that. But the part I want to, and this is Roland's question about good friction, we have that's a theme that runs throughout the book. We actually have a Wall Street Journal article coming out in just a few days that focuses mostly on good friction, ideas about good friction from the book. And so our argument is that with all this pressure about going fast, 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 there's a whole bunch of times when you want to make things difficult or impossible, and when you also want to slow down. One of them is, just to start with, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, as he makes this argument, when you're in a cognitive minefield, when things are messed up, when you're confused, sometimes the best thing to do is just stand there and figure out what's going on, rather than to rush ahead and do damage. So we use the example of Waze, the navigation software. There was a point early on in the life of their organization. They got a bunch of Series B funding. Noam Barden, the CEO, is under pressure to do product development and hire people. But when people downloaded the software, they wouldn't even keep it for a few days. So he put the whole company, stopped the whole company, kind of pulled over, to use the analogy, spent 6 weeks figuring out what was going on, and then started fixing things and hiring people. So we think of the analogy of the gas and the brakes. Some other examples of good friction: there are some things that should be hard, inefficient, and frustrating. I don't know any other way to run a real creative process. If somebody can show me an organization where real creativity is done, where it's smooth and it's beautiful and people succeed all the time, Henning, I know you studied this a lot, but there's no other way I can figure out for creativity to happen without sort of one painful iteration after another through life, and conflict and so forth. So creativity is not a particularly efficient process. And then one more, we have all sorts of examples of when friction is good versus bad. There's some really cool new research since our book was completed, that it's out of Germany actually, that shows that when you have people who are higher versus lower IQ, when people have higher IQs, they tend to solve simple problems more quickly, but it takes them longer to solve than people with lower IQs to solve complex problems, because they slow down to get them right. And this is done with fMRI and all this sort of stuff. And on the sort of friction fixing sort of analogy, when we look at really great efforts to get rid of bad friction in organization, we have an example from the state of Michigan in the United States, where a form was drastically reduced from 1,000 questions to about, it was 80% shorter. It was a benefits form for the state of Michigan. And in that case, the CEO of that nonprofit, his name is Michael Brennan, he slowed everything down to make sure to get everybody on board in the state, to make sure to comply to 1,700 pages of rules, and to do user testings and to roll it out properly. And so from our perspective, in terms of good versus bad friction, when you're doing something really complicated that requires having the participation and input with lots of people, the idea of sort of moving fast and break things in that situation often will get you in trouble, and it may throw you in jail too.
You know, so a lot of my work has been on Formula One racing, and I remember I talked to the manager about how they assess drivers and the difficulty of driving a Formula One car. And he said, like, you know, every idiot can put the pedal to the metal. The key thing is figuring out the breaking point. That's the thing which is difficult, right? So very much about, you see, like, it's obviously you need to keep the thing at speed, but actually figuring out when you actually need to break down and change. That's kind of the hard part. Bob, you had I would love to dive down in this addition sickness a little bit. Like, we are adding so much, and you see, like, it feels like there's a human component, but there's also an organizational component. Yeah.
So first of all, let's start with the human component. And I love plugging my friend's book. Okay, so this book, Subtract by Leidy Klotz, it's a great book. So Leidy and a bunch of his friends at University of Virginia, they did all these studies of essentially, you give a human being a problem, what's their natural response to solving it? Fixing a Lego model, planning a vacation, improving a recipe, improving a university. They found that the default human solution is addition. So we are just sort of wired. We see a problem, we want to add more complexity. That's the bad news. The good news, some of their experiments with Lego models, including, is when you prompt people to think of subtraction solutions, they will do it. So that's sort of the way we're wired. The second problem are the incentives. And I've touched on this a little bit, but in most organizations that I know, especially if you're not a frontline professional, if you're in an administrative role, the more things you add, the more programs you start, the bigger your team, the more software you buy, the more meetings you hold. These are signs of sort of prestige, and we either punish or don't notice people who don't add stuff and who subtract stuff very often. And we know that this is one of the things Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for. People hate when you take things away from them. People don't like when you lose things. So it's kind of tough being the person who does subtraction. In fact, I was just talking to Mike Schroepfer. Mike Schrepp, he was CTO of Facebook for about 8 years. And he said, we'd have too many different platforms. And I was always taking things away from people because when you have different platforms, it causes all these switching problems. And he said, there's people who still hate me for taking away their pet baby. And this is this idea, you know, the way we put it in the book scientifically is we quote George Carlin, the late great comedian. And he has this line that my shit is stuff and your stuff is shit. So it's always this notion that my one little program or my one little pet project is what matters. And that can be a problem in an organization. We sort of hang on to what means so much to us, even though the organization doesn't really need it. So those are some of the reasons that addition sickness occurs. But the good news is there's a whole bunch of things that organizations do to make subtraction happen anyways. So it does happen.
Roland asked about what are examples of like good friction. You have a few more in mind, Bob, like where you would say like, hey, this is an example of good friction you want to have.
Yeah. So to me, another example of good friction, I'll do two. One is just the IKEA effect, which is that one thing that, well, every fraternity, every sorority, every military, and IKEA knows that making things easier isn't necessarily better, because when people struggle a little bit, they become more attached to one another and to the product. So making it too easy to get in and out of your store actually might be a problem, because when people have to struggle a little bit, there's this thing called labor leads to love. So it's a design solution that sometimes does work. Another sign of sort of good friction is there's all this research you hear now on things like flash teams and instant relationships. If we look at the academic literature on what are the most effective startup teams, including Kathy Eisenhart, she has evidence on this. What are the most effective surgical teams? What are the most effective R&D teams? It turns out that when people have prior joint experiences and they've worked out the relationship and developed their collective skills and intelligence together, those are the most effective teams in the world. And so that's one thing. And the example that I love to use is Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who just died. They worked together 60 years. They did a pretty good job. So that's one. And then my favorite one, and I'm kind of obsessed with this since the book was completed, is there's this great academic research on savoring. And so you talk about, there's the coping literature, there's all these bad things in life you have to deal with, but there's some things in life that people with good mental health who slow down and they enjoy the awe of nature, a beautiful meal, a conversation with a friend, and this idea of sort of slowing down. Sometimes that requires adding a little bit of friction. In our favorite example from the book, and maybe we have some folks from the Netherlands here. The largest grocery store chain in the Netherlands is called Jumbo. And we fact checked this extensively just recently too. And it turns out that there's an anti-loneliness movement in Holland that's been going on. And as kind of part of all that, they've been experimenting with slow lanes, chit-chat lanes, where instead of rushing out of the supermarket, especially sort of older, lonely people, in the chit-chat lane, you stop for 4 or 5 minutes and chat with the clerk. And that's the way it's designed. And they tried it in one store, and now it's been scaled out to 200 stores. So to me, that's the opposite of efficiency. That's sort of introducing a corporate movement to encourage savoring. So I sort of love that. So I mean, those are just examples of good friction. but for us, that's why, although we started out this book being frustrated by friction and driving us crazy, there are some things in life that should be slow, hard, and difficult, or impossible.
But so one thing I like a lot about the book is how you kind of mix academic evidence with like very practical examples. So there are the classics, there's Thompson in there, but they also very recent stuff by Gillian Chown and Melissa Valentine, and so fantastic studies that have recently been conducted. The one thing I kept on wondering is like, where's all this friction, so to speak, coming from? And I was thinking about which class I would somebody send to in an MBA. And so you see, in many ways, the book kind of, you see, there are all kinds of theoretical ideas, and there's strategy, there's OB in here, and like you can say it's accounting part of it. So I wondered if you can, because we have a lot of MBAs on the call, I wondered if you have like a take on this, like, why is this such a problem? Why don't people not see through this, so to speak? And I wondered if the way how we educate people is in part the culprit.
Well, that's okay. Now that nobody's ever asked me that question. That's a really interesting question. And of course, I mean, in the book, we have like different on-ramps to fix it. So it could be leadership, behavior, it could be language. We talked about addition sickness, but for destructive friction, if I was going to pick one, and this is a little bit of love to the people out there in supply chain and logistics too, I would say that that very often, especially senior leaders and local politicians, we are sort of obsessed with building organizations with great parts, not with gluing those parts together. And that's in the U.S. healthcare system. That's the problem. It's a story of friction and fragmentation. In the U.S., we have some of the best equipment and people in the world. The problem is sort of coordinating all their work, and that was a problem that we saw over and over again. If I look at the story of Microsoft, which is a great bad news, good news story, that was a situation where not only were people very sort of compartmentalized, they were encouraged by the reward system to do backstabbing openly. And we talk about this in the book. We talk about how at Microsoft, and this is when I used to give talks there, people would talk openly about the bad old days with Steve Ballmer. You got ahead not just by doing good work, but by stomping on the people around you. So to me, there's both incentive for cooperation, and then there's all those logistics of gluing together all the different handoffs. And so the cognitive bias that needs to be fought here, and this is from our colleague, Chip Heath's studied this. He called this coordination neglect. And again, once again, he says, we as humans are wired to think about organizations and other things in terms of having great pieces. He calls this coordination neglect, not how the pieces all fit together. So if I was going to pick sort of one thing that where the power really is, I think that's what I would pick, would be this problem of coordination neglect.
So Mikhail has a question, but by the way, let me say one thing about the Microsoft example. I found that was by far the most shocking part in the book. That is when I read this, was like, can't believe you actually wrote this. But so it's fascinating because it's very real. You get a feeling for how the people are. I find the book very human in that sense, by the way, that it's not like, oh, organizations and efficiency, but there's a lot of emotion in the book and how these people get frustrated and what you can actually do about it.
Let me talk a little bit about Microsoft, since I've been involved intermittently with Microsoft during the bad old days and now the good old days too. They've been kind of an intermittent client and have other involvement with them. One thing I've always admired about the culture at all stages, they are one of the most open organizations about talking about their problems. I to the point of it being shocking. And so you talk about Kim Scott's radical candor. One of the things that hasn't changed from Ballmer to Satya is they're still very open about their problems. Sometimes they just stagger me about how openly they talk about the ways they're messed up. They're too self-critical almost. So that is one thing I do admire about their culture.
Mikhail has a great question. Could you describe how structurally scrutinize and address those useless friction in an organization? So it's Mikhail Bruev.
Well, so how to structurally scrutinize and address the useless frictions in an boy. Well, so what we got is the whole field of supply chain and logistics, and I'm going to answer this in 1 minute. but
we
so,
go.
so I guess the place that I would start, that's just too much. I just have to laugh because you've got like what is it, half the MBA curriculum or something like this is an operations research. Haven't even touched on OR. But one of the things that we like to do in sort of an MBA sort of exercise, and when we do this with other organizations too, the design school, is to simply try to design ways that either what is it, leaders or students can take the journey through the organization that customers do, that employees do, so that they feel it themselves and figure out the places where the handoffs are messed up so they can be fixed. And to be concrete, and this isn't in the book, but it's the kind of thing we do all the time. Years ago, we used to do a lot of work with JetBlue Airlines in the United States, and we just had our students follow passengers from the time they got off the curb to get on the airplane, and then follow passengers from the time that they left the airport to the airport. Just simple following them, and this is a pretty obvious thing. We've all done it, but what they looked for was sources of friction and annoyance. And what our students discovered was the worst part about flying JetBlue Airlines was that the luggage carousel was confusing, it was noisy, it was late, there was no information, and everybody's just exhausted at the end of the flight, so it sucks. And so they present this to the senior executives at JetBlue, and they all said, "Oh, we never check luggage." So this is this notion we never have that experience, because and to us, I thought that was really quite revealing. And they were, by the way, building out a new airport, and some of the lessons from the students did get applied to the airport. But to me, that idea of sort of like taking the journey, another example of something that we did, and these are examples of sort of exposing the executives to what it feels like to travel through your system. To me, the most impressive example that we encountered, and I've already talked about it some, was this 1,000-word or 1,000-question benefit form that was asked of 2.5 million Michigan residents to get government benefits, healthcare, and so forth. 1,000 questions long, and 42 pages. One question was, when was your child conceived? Just ridiculous. One of the things that they did, Michael Brennan and his team, was they brought in people from the agency who were responsible for this form, the top 8, and had them fill it out. The guy who was head of the agency could not get past page 8 in the 42-page form. So he felt the pain of what was happening. And as he said, I'm a lot more well-educated than the average Michigander who fills this out. And to his credit, and the team's credit, they didn't get all defensive like maybe many corporate executives did. They said, "My goodness, we have to work together to fix that." And that's one reason this is called Sevilla. We talk about it in the book. Your folks in your audience can just go to the Sevilla website and read about project reform. But it's really a case where they reduced the burden by 80% on 2.5 million people. And it started with a bunch of empathy exercises and a really taking the time to understand what's the journey like through the system and how can we make that journey less painful.
Bob, there's one topic you do not talk about in the book, but it came up from an anonymous attendee at according to my time, this is 10:36. I think for you this is 7:36. By the way, thank you so much for getting up at 7 a.m. to do this. And how do you see diversity, whether of people, perspective, or ways of working impacting friction levels? So you don't talk about diversity in the book, but I wondered if this is somehow featured by bringing like a diverse perspective on the issue. So I would love to get your take on that.
Well, diversity is not something that we talk about a lot in the book, but one place where I think that we do talk about it, and I've been involved in the DEI movement in so many ways. I'm not going to go down that road, but one of the places where I think diversity does matter is that in terms of diversity of understanding of how a system works. Because one of the things that we see, and this is sometimes part of this coordination problem we're talking about or component focus is very often when somebody has one really narrow technical, social, or gendered point of view, and they think that everybody is exactly like them and their needs are all that matter. You end up with an organization that is both homogenous and ineffective. And when you see organizations that are based on different functions, different point of views, and the leadership sort of glues it together, they're more effective. And to give you an example that's a little bit more concrete on this, we know that when somebody runs an organization, they've only ever been in accounting, you end up with all sorts of ugly results that are focused on short-term efficiency, as opposed to when people have had a diversity of experiences, they understand the different perspectives of the people and how things glue together. And that's why, since I bashed General Motors, I'll say something good about Mary Barra, who might be, if you look at difficulty, the best CEO in the United States, because running General Motors is really a lot harder than running Microsoft, with all due respect to Satya Nadella. So her last job was head of HR. Before that, she was head of product development. Before that, she was head of manufacturing. Before that, she ran a plant. So if you look at Mary Barra, she's somebody who understands how the pieces are and has sort of done the grand tour through the system. She's not just, for example, a manufacturing person, which is important, but it's not enough. So just for understanding how the pieces fit together, I think the diversity of experience is important. Oh, there's one more thing I should say on that. There's also hierarchical diversity. One theme that does run through the book is that in the best organizations, especially ones that fix coordination and collaboration problems, it tends to be that the people at the top actually understand how it feels like to work at the bottom of the organization or to be clients, as I've already emphasized. So I don't think that's a satisfactory diversity answer, but this is not a book about diversity. It's a book about friction.
Let me double down on this point you just made about hierarchy, because Elizabeth Pinkerton just asked a question a few minutes ago on this. It's 7:44 for you.
I see it.
When scaling an org, friction can arise when leaders feel a loss of control. So they impose new processes and systems, but that also causes a lot of friction. How do you balance control with friction?
Well, first of all, Elizabeth, that's a great question. It's almost like a disease, because what happens is, and if we use a little organizational language, there does come a point in the organization where it becomes impossible to run it by personal influence. You have to have processes. So there has to be rules that apply to everyone. There needs to be maybe a little bit of a hierarchy, but the best I can talk about here, and I want to add one more thing to this. Almost every organization I've been involved with, I'm thinking about IDEO, I'm thinking about Facebook. I used to work with Facebook and they're very small. They reach this point where the senior executives, the founders, walk in and say, my God, what happened here? This used to be my organization. I don't even understand how the thing works or how to get anything done. So to me, what you're describing really is a problem. And the best I can do to think about this is to just be aware of the notion that everybody around you, when you're building a hierarchy, their natural tendency when you're building the hierarchy is to add more complexity, to throw people at problems, and by the way, to spend money on stupid stuff too that adds friction too. And what the best leaders tend to do is they tend to be frugal about adding stuff to organization or spending money, not just because it costs money, but because it slows down the whole system. And I'll give you, since we're doing negative examples, 3 organizations in the United States I know which have some unpleasant characteristics. One reason I believe they've been so successful is they're so allergic to unnecessary addition. Amazon, cheapest company I've ever dealt with in my life. Nothing close. Well, the second cheapest, Walmart, in terms of adding any sort of complexity. So Amazon and Walmart are the main 2 ones that I would think, and IKEA is another example too. But this idea of having sort of like almost like a frugalness as it sort of scale. Oh, what other one I was going to say was Apple. So Apple's just amazing. Tim Cook, for how complicated that organization is, has done an amazing job. one of the things that many of you may know is that in the Silicon Valley, there's all these companies doing layoffs. Apple is not doing layoffs. They have changed some strategic direction, because when every tech company was doing adding during the early stages of the pandemic, he did not encourage excessive hiring, something that goes way back. So that is a great question, and my perspective is that if you're slow to add complexity in people in the first place, you will have less of a mess on your hands. And just one more thing, Elizabeth. So a good friend of mine, she's one of the standard heads of HR at Silicon Valley. There's 4 or 5 of them. They sort of move around. So she just left her position, head of HR, and she's looking for a better one. There is so much money for AI startups in Silicon Valley right now. It's just terrible. They're just throwing money at the problem, every venture capitalist. And so she said the problem that these companies that keep interviewing me have is that they have like 7 or 8 engineers, and that's all they need. But then they've got $100 million in venture capital or more, and they just think I'm supposed to hire a bunch of people for them. And she says, I says to them, we can hire a bunch of people. It'll slow you down and make you worse. Your competitors will kill you if you hire too many people. And to me, that's an example of the kind of dynamics, is that if you start spending money or hiring people as a substitute for doing the right thing, you will make your company bigger and dumber at an excessively fast rate.
Frances Fry has I quote her in my class, then she has this quote: growth is not the goal, but it's a beautiful kind of outcome if you do a lot of things right, in that sense.
Yes,
so
yes.
Yeah. Bob, it's in terms of kind of, you have this beautiful example that one company actually changed its outlook in a way that every meeting kind of stopped 5 minutes early and began 5 minutes late. So in these 10 minutes basically saved a lot of time in the organization. So being a trustee of people's time, I thought, like, we are not running late. What I would like to do is, let me see if this is completely myself here today. I'm on my own hosting this show. I thought I'd quickly share the link to the book.
Thank you.
The book has not yet come out, but the book comes out any day now. So
so the pub dates, since you're in Europe, for the US version, the 30th. And then in the UK, I'll even show the UK version, Penguin, February 15th. So you can pre-order it now, as they say.
Wonderful. I have read the whole book. Even my child already engaged with it, as you can see. So 2-year-old Felix. No matter if you get the audiobook or the hard book, everything is going to be better than a 300-page PDF that I printed out. Otherwise, I can highly recommend to kind of follow Bob Sutton on LinkedIn. I think you're less active on X or Twitter these days, but highly active on LinkedIn. It's a constant kind of pleasure and information of news for me. The other person you should definitely follow is Henning Pizunka. There are 400,000 thought leaders, yes, but just one Henning Pizunka on LinkedIn. Otherwise, Bob, I'm going to ask you to do one thing that we didn't prepare, but maybe you can introduce the next speaker, which we're going to have on February 9th. It's Amy Edmondson. And I thought,
oh my gosh, Amy Edmondson is the best. She, in terms of being a great teacher, a great scholar, and somebody who really cares about getting stuff done, it's unbelievable. And she's a world-class engineer. When she was in her 20s, she worked for Buckminster Fuller of the geodesic dome fame, and she wrote a book called The Fuller Explanation that talked about the technology of his work. She's remarkable. She's interviewing me on Friday on a show in the States, so people want to see it. What's it? It's 10 o'clock Pacific time. So she's actually interviewing me later in the week. She's one of my heroes. Absolutely. I think she's the most influential and important organizational theorist right now. I really think she is. And she's somebody who takes rigorous research and turns it into making life better. So I'm just a huge fan of Amy Edmondson. I'm so glad. I think I'm more enthusiastic about her than almost anybody I can think of in academia. She's just remarkable.
I'm so glad I asked you to make this introduction. So if you're interested, it's February 9th. I'm going to announce it on LinkedIn. I'm also going to shoot you an email. Bob, thank you so much for
Oh,
being a
thank
great
you.
trustee of people's time. This was great fun. Congratulations on writing a fantastic book. Another one.
Thank you. And thank you for, it's great to have an excuse to talk to you, to be honest. And thank the whole audience for all your questions and engagement. I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much. All right. Take care of yourself. And if you can, take care of somebody else. Okay. On that note, take care.